A Level 4 virology facility is a lab equipped to work with the most serious and deadly human and animal diseases. That makes the Arlington Street Lab one of only a handful in North America capable of handling pathogens requiring the highest level of containment, such as Ebola. This Winnipeg-based Canadian lab was targeted by Chinese agents. On July 5, 2018, officials at the National Microbiology Laboratory, NML, in Winnipeg, Canada, escorted Xiang Okayu, biologist Keding Cheng, and an unknown number of her students from the lab and revoked their access rights. The Public Health Agency of Canada, which operates the lab, confirmed it had referred an administrative matter. The deadly animal virus epidemic spreading globally may have originated in a Wuhan laboratory linked to China's covert biological weapons program. From 2015 showing China's most advanced virus research laboratory known the Wuhan Institute of Virology. The laboratory is the only declared site in China capable of working with deadly viruses. The institute is linked to Beijing's covert biological weapons program. Certain laboratories in the institute have probably been engaged, in terms of research and development, in Chinese biological weapons.
The Wuhan coronavirus, people are starting to drop on the floor due to the virus.
It's a move being hailed as a crucial moment in the fight against pathogens such as the Ebola virus. Officials say the facility is the first in China that will be equipped to handle Class 4 pathogens. These are dangerous viruses that pose a high risk of person-to-person transmission, such as those that cause damaging fevers like Ebola. The laboratory in Wuhan, Hubei province was built in cooperation with a French bio-industrial firm and the Chinese Academy of Sciences. It joins just a handful of labs around the world cleared to handle the most highly pathogenic germs. The announcement comes amid heightened global efforts to fight the world's worst ever Ebola epidemic in Africa, which has killed more than half of the 6,500 people it has infected.
A Level 4 lab opened in Hubei's city of Wuhan, China, finally has a lab that meets international standards for such labs. The lab was co-designed by France and China and was built by Chinese workers.
The facility is an essential platform for research and development concerning highly contagious and infectious diseases. It is the first such lab to be built in China.
The lab was built with significant investment and strict construction protocols over the course of 10 years. The new facility will allow Chinese scientists to study life-threatening infectious diseases. The Wuhan Institute of Virology said the lab is a specialized core facility for studying dangerous contagious diseases and must implement the highest possible safety measures.
The laboratory is like a sealed box. Nothing inside can come out. We have to ensure that conditions in the laboratory are in a state of negative pressure in order to prevent anything from getting out.
Number one, the firewall must come down. It must come down. The people of China, the citizens of China, the decent, hardworking, old 100 names in China have to be able to communicate to the world. They have to get out there and tell them what their situation is. The world has to see this unfiltered by the Chinese Communist Party. And right now, there is no justification, no moral justification to have the firewall up. This is an emergency and it's a humanitarian crisis. The firewall must come down, and any American company that's providing technology or capital or personnel to keep that firewall up is going to burn in hell, okay? Because now they are just prolonging the suffering of the Chinese people. That's number one. Number two, and I said this a couple weeks ago, the Chinese Communist Party must take the best doctors from the world, from the CDC, the World Health Organization, from the Imperial College in London, from Hong Kong University, Dr. Gabriel Leung, the top virus hunters, the best, have to be allowed to get into Wuhan and Hubei province and see and report back exactly what the problem is and what their recommendations are. And number three, the Chinese Communist Party has to be able to accept doctors and nurses from all over the world that would volunteer, military or otherwise, to go to Wuhan and go to Hubei. Because right now we see, I think there's 5,000 doctors and nurses that are infected. Okay? The new crisis you have is a collapse of the public health system in the central province and in Wuhan city. If that collapses, you can have tens of millions of people die. And that is something the CCP can avoid by taking nurses and doctors from all over the world and let them go to those central things. Until the government does that, to me, it's showing that two things. Number one, they don't care about the Chinese people. They don't care how many people die. And number two, they don't care about people throughout the world. What they care about is what they've always cared about, and that is their hold on power and their hold on wealth.
China says the coronavirus epidemic is coming down. But is it really so? Steve K. Bannon, host of War Room Pandemic, sat down with me to discuss the most critical aspects of this pandemic. What's the truth in China? Why did the Chinese government still refuse to let American experts in? Could the virus be made in a lab? Why does the Chinese leadership rush biosafety legislation? Could America see generic drug shortages if the epidemic prolongs? I'm Simone Gao, and you are watching Zooming In. Thank you, Mr. Bannon, for being with us again.
Thanks for having me on, Simone.
Okay, so we've been hearing conflicting messages from the Chinese government these days. Well, on one hand, the Politburo sent out a statement that the Wuhan situation is not under control. But if we look at the CDC number from China, just during the last week, the numbers, the newly added confirmed cases has been dropping. Every day from A week ago, it was 15,000 newly added cases. Yesterday was 395. So what is going on?
First of all, every number you're seeing that comes out of the CCP and comes out of China is a total and complete lie. They're all lies. You know, they've tried to go back and have different methodologies about how they're counting this. So people should just discount that. And I know people that watch your show are sophisticated enough to understand the CCP just lies. It's the crime is that the mainstream media in the West repeats these lies over and over and over again. As we sit here today doing this interview, 1/10 of the world's humanity, 10% of the world's humanity is under some form of quarantine in central China. We have anywhere from 60 to 80 million, maybe 100 million people in Hubei and around surrounding areas under a strict quarantine. We have another 4 or 5 or 600 million people throughout the rest of China on some form of lockdown, which is a quasi quarantine. And the reason that is, there's only 2 ways right now to solve this virus. A vaccine, which a vaccine is anywhere from 6 months to a year and a half, 2 years away. Or what they call social separation, which is quarantine. And what we know is that there are not 700 million people under some form of quarantine with only 70,000 infected. The numbers are huge. Miles Guo says there's millions. Other people, scientists are saying there are hundreds of thousands. The deaths go from anywhere from, Miles Guo says it's over 200,000 to other people are saying it's in the tens of thousands. But one thing I can guarantee you and promise you, that the numbers that the CCP are putting out are total and complete lies. And here's why we know this. Right now, today, when we're doing this interview, just before we started, the Politburo came out and said, quote, "We do not have the situation in Hubei province or in Wuhan under control, and that it is, quote unquote, more complex and more severe than we anticipated." And so they are essentially, which is a huge loss of face, right? And particularly this is the committee that President Xi, he's the convening authority. He's the top person. He and Wang Xishan. And so for them to put that out for the world's media to see, admitting that they are not on top of this situation in Wuhan, this biblical plague that has infected the poor people of China, is in the mainstream media. It should be outraged that they've taken these lies for so long and just kind of repeated them. And now you're starting to see, I think the lies are coming to part because you can no longer control the information that's coming out of Wuhan. The tragedy of Wuhan, led by one of the stories, and your audience should understand, that affected people most in the United States, was the chief medical officer for the Wuchang hospital in Wuhan when he died, right, in the line of service to help his fellow countrymen in China. When the ambulance moved away to take his body to be cremated, his poor wife, who's one of the nurses, was banging on the ambulance and crying out for her dead husband. That really hit many Americans in the heart. And so I think you're seeing today that the Chinese Communist Party, who lies about everything, now their lies are being exposed to a global audience.
Mm-hmm. Just last week, I attended a CDC briefing at the National Press Club in the States, in D.C., and the spokesperson from the CDC was still praising the Chinese government for transparency and their ability to build those massive hospitals. And she cited the official number from China. So my question is, do you think the American government is aware of the possibility of the scope of this epidemic?
I think there's there's obviously different people in the government. The official policy is to try to be, and one of the reasons I think they've been doing that, and President Trump has been reinforcing that and saying good things about Xi, is they're trying to get the cooperation of the Chinese Communist Party to actually give real information, and most importantly to allow CDC personnel, virus hunters, in from the World Health Organization, CDC, Hong Kong University, Dr. Gabriel Leung, others that could actually go to Wuhan and start to get their hands around this situation. I think they feel that if they call out the CCP, the Chinese Communist Party, for their lies, that it'd be much tougher to get there. There are many people in the government that know that the Chinese Communist Party is lying to people. They're lying about these numbers. They're not being transparent at all. But I believe for the greater good, remember, we can't start to solve this problem. This This is Dr. Thea and Lian Chan Han had this two-part articles in The Hill called the Biological Chernobyl, brought on by the CCP. Until we actually get world experts in there to assist the Chinese people and to assist these heroic doctors, you're only going to have this virus is only going to metastasize. The number one priority for everybody is to get there and help the Chinese people, to help stop this in China, and by stopping that, to stop it spreading throughout the world. And so that's what I think President Trump is trying to accomplish. But as everybody that watches your show knows, or goes to NTD TV or goes to the Epoch Times, they understand that the Chinese Communist Party is a collection of gangsters. They think like gangsters. They operate like gangsters. And they don't care. And I've said this many times. They do not care if 25 or 30 million Chinese die in Hubei province or in central China. They could care less. All they care about is holding on to power. And so all you're going to see is a continuation of their lies and their misrepresentations.
Mm-hmm. As you said, 760 million Chinese people are under quarantine and half China is locked down. But things are not improving. The spread of the virus is not being stopped. What does that tell us?
It tells you that it's out of control. We have a pandemic. Dr. Stephen Hatfield wrote this book, and I recommend everybody in your audience get this. It's called 3 Seconds to Midnight. Dr. Hatfield is one of the world's leading experts, here in the United States, one of the top experts on pandemics. In this book, he goes through all the historical pandemics. He wrote this book before this pandemic came out, but it's really scary. And what Dr. Hatfield says, there's only two ways to solve this right now, a vaccine or social separation in a quarantine. He was just on our show, War Room Pandemic, the other day, and what he said was, this is proven, because it continues to have to quarantine additional people, that the quarantine, the social separation in central China is not working. And here's why it's not working. Number one, they suppressed the information for too long. They lied to people for too long. So the possibility they had to contain this back in December, the Chinese Communist Party misled everybody and lied about everything. It then has now metastasized, and it's gotten out of control. And the measures they've tried to put in are just not that thorough. You know, you've seen what they've tried to do, and they're just not that on top of things. And so this continues to spread. Dr. Hatfield and many of the experts here think that it's gotten now out of control in China. And one of the things he says, and other people like Miles Gore and myself say, you can tell how out of control it is because no one on that central committee today in Beijing, not one person, and not Wang Xishan and not Xi, have been to Wuhan, right? And the question has to be from the Chinese people, why have their leaders not come to Wuhan to assess the situation in person? There's two reasons. Reason number one, they don't want to be associated with the failures of the quarantine, right? They're firing local party cadres, but they don't want to be associated. Number two, they don't want to die, okay? When you have the senior medical personnel, the doctor that's in charge of the number one hospital and the doctor that's really in charge of kind of the overall medicine for the entire and public health safety for the entire region, when he dies by contracting the virus and he's dead, that's why CCP will not go down there. So all of their other talk is happy talk. Until Xi goes to Wuhan and stands at a quarantine center and looks the Chinese people in the eye and says, I'm on top of this and I'm going to be here until this thing is solved, it's all lies. And so every stat they put out, every number they put out, every way they want to spin it is a total and complete lie. This is Beijing where all the party cadres are. This is Shanghai where many of the party cadres and the most sophisticated businessmen, when they sit there and they don't believe anything the CCP says, that tells you everything you need to know about the CCP. They know they're lying. They know you can't depend upon their information. So if you want to save yourself, you essentially have to self-quarantine. So you have among the wealthiest and most powerful people. This is how deadly this virus is. No matter how powerful you are, no matter how wealthy you are, you're not protected by this. And that's why the wealthiest and most powerful people in the most powerful centers in China are now self-quarantined.
This week's China News headlines. First up, the coronavirus, now known as COVID-19. Currently, it's believed the virus spread from this wet market in the Chinese city of Wuhan. However, that might not have been the original source. Therefore, there's only one logical explanation. It was a bioweapon that escaped a Chinese lab! Yes, I'm channeling Alex Jones, but that's not his conspiracy. Maybe he believes it, but he didn't come up with it. It's actually a widely popular theory spreading almost as fast as COVID-19. So much so that Fox News anchor Maria Bartiromo actually asked that question to White House trade advisor Peter Navarro.
They knew that coronavirus had happened back in December. They sent a delegation to the White House to shake everybody's hand. They knew that they had this virus that had started for the phase 1. Then they sent the largest delegation ever to Davos. And now the ambassador to China was on one of the Sunday shows this weekend, and he did not deny that coronavirus could have started in a weapons lab. Do we know if this started in a research lab, and how come they won't allow the CDC in there to better understand how this started? Because if they started this in a weapons lab, that's evidence that they are developing or trying to develop weapons of mass destruction, biological weapons.
Whether it occurs by the quirk of nature or at the hand of a terrorist, epidemiologists showed through their models that a respiratory spread pathogen would kill more than 30 million people in less than a year. And there is a reasonable probability of that taking place in the years ahead. It's hard to get our minds around a catastrophe of that scale, but it has happened. In 1918, a particularly virulent flu strain called the Spanish flu killed over 50 million people, more than World War I. The fact that a global pandemic has not occurred in recent history shouldn't be a mistake for evidence that it won't occur. Even if the next epidemic is not on the scale of that 1918 flu, we have to consider the social and economic turmoil that even a smaller size epidemic would create. We saw this with Ebola as it got into the urban centers of the 3 affected countries, and it was only by diverting polio resources that we avoided it getting into the urban areas of Nigeria.
That the one lab in China, a pathogen 4 lab at the highest levels, built by France after SARS to help the Chinese people find vaccines for more SARS-like virus. It's not by chance that that's in Wuhan. The only one in all China is relatively close to where the market was. We got to pray that it's not something that either came out of trying to work on a vaccine and leaked out of the lab, or it was part of a biological weapons program. The disturbing thing about the CCP is the moves they're making now, talk about biological lab safety and things like that, concern me. Also, some of the rumors they're trying to start that the CIA was in back of this start to concern me. The people in China and the expatriate Chinese should understand that the Chinese Communist Party has a terrible record when it comes to biological weapons, okay? And they're hiding and lying of their biological weapons program. So you have many voices in the West now, Senator Tom Cotton, Bill Gertz, Miles Guo, and others that are sitting there going, it's all lies and it came out of their weapons program. I think we ought to pray that it was natural, because that means it's going to be easier to find a vaccine. There are many things about this virus that are quite concerning. Okay, number one is the asymptomatic period. You know, many people have caught it have said, hey, the person I actually caught it from didn't have any symptoms.
That's right.
Dr. Li, the great hero of Wuhan, he was the whistleblower. He was the one that the Chinese Communist Party, in their devil nature, tried to make him sign a thing saying he was a rumor monger. They tried to ruin his career. They were going to throw him in prison. It turns out he was right. He was a truth teller. He was a whistleblower. If they had listened to Dr. Li and his cohorts of 8 doctors back in December, they might have gotten a grip on this thing. But what they cared about is their power, and they said, no, you're a rumor monger. You had to sign these documents that said Dr. Li basically had to say he was lying. Dr. Li then went back to, when he was basically exonerated by the Supreme Court of China, he went back to the hospital to volunteer to work again, okay, to help this. And he says later, when he was dying in his last interview with the New York Times, he said, I made a mistake. I got careless. He took off his hazmat suit and didn't have all the thing when he worked on an 82-year-old patient that had no symptoms. And he caught the disease from her, and he was dead 10 days later. And I understand that the doctor, the head medical professional in Wuchang Hospital, I've been told, I haven't verified it, that he also caught this from someone that was asymptomatic. So right now we don't know, and one of the reasons we don't know is that the CCP is not allowing the world's top virus hunters in there to check this out. Everybody's depending on information they give. And you can't depend on anything the CCP gives you because they lie as easily as they draw breath.
Mm-hmm. You know, the BBC did an interview with a doctor who was treating the first patient of this coronavirus outbreak. And this man, he's like an older man.
Yes,
and
patient zero.
Patient zero. We don't know if it's patient zero, but just call him patient zero. He is bedridden. He doesn't have any mobility. He doesn't have any, obviously he didn't go to the seafood market. But the interesting thing is the doctor will not reveal like who he has contacted with, because this man cannot get this virus by himself, right? We know he's not related to the market, but who he has contacted with, the doctor wouldn't reveal. So I think that's kind of telling, right?
It's telling, and it's unacceptable. The world's down. 31 nations in the world have this. The world's economy is about to basically lock down because of the Chinese, the interlocked nature of the global supply system, the global supply chain coming out of China. One belt, one road. Things you and I have talked about many times. This is what Senator Tom Cotton has to say. Senator Tom Cotton says, it's not incumbent upon the world to come in and find this information and keep asking questions. It's incumbent upon the Chinese Communist Party in Beijing and the rulers, okay, to come forward and have the world come in right now to both assist the Chinese people and to help protect the safety of the world. This shows you something we have said for years and years and years and years. The Chinese Communist Party is a danger to the Chinese people, and more importantly, they're a danger to all mankind. They think like gangsters. They're a bunch of thugs. And now they've got this situation. They either created or if they didn't create it and it was natural, they suppressed the information about it and lied about it to keep their own power. Either way, they have helped destroy China. And now in doing this, they're starting to destroy the entire world. That's why they have to be held accountable.
I want to talk about the biggest and the most important story in the world, the Wuhan coronavirus. This coronavirus is a catastrophe on the scale of Chernobyl for China. But actually, it's probably worse than Chernobyl, which was localized in its effect. The coronavirus could result in a global pandemic. While you were all sleeping overnight, the number of diagnosed cases in China increased by 30%. Now, let me be clear, that's not new cases, that is just newly admitted cases. It is probably several orders of magnitude higher than that. Also, while you were sleeping, China now has its entire border with Russia closed. 2,600 miles, Russia has closed that border. El Al has shut down travel between Israel and China. Air France has shut down travel between China and France. And that's in addition to all the other countries that have already shut down travel. From what we know so far, and there's still many unknowns, this virus could have both a long incubation period, as much as 14 days, and individuals could be contagious while asymptomatic, which was not the case with SARS in 2003. Furthermore, from some cases, it appears that the virus could be aerosolized, which means it doesn't require the kind of contact that you have with, say, a married couple kissing each other or a family living in close quarters in a hotel or apartment, but rather the distances we are all sitting apart right now. Yet China is still lying about all of this. They've been lying about it from the very beginning, and you don't need their history of lying about SARS in 2003, though it is relevant here. You just have to see what's happened over the last 2 months. We now know that the first case manifested no later than December 1, even though China didn't reveal it to the WHO until a month later on December 31st, when they continued to hide it from their own citizens. And they continued to say that it had been contained inside Wuhan. Today, it is in every single province in China. They also claimed for almost 2 months, until earlier this week, that it had originated in a seafood market in Wuhan, that locals had contracted it from animals in, say, bat soup or snake tartare. That is not the case. The Lancet published a study last weekend demonstrating that of the original 40 cases, 14 of them had no contact with the seafood market, including patient 0. As one epidemiologist said, that virus went into the seafood market before it came out of the seafood market. We still don't know where it originated. Could have been another seafood market. Could have been a farm. Could have been a food processing company. I would note that Wuhan also has China's only biosafety level 4 super laboratory that works with the world's most deadly pathogens to include, yes, coronavirus. Now, look at China's own actions. They have quarantined 60 million people, 60 million, more than the entire population of our West Coast. They've shut down schools indefinitely. Classes canceled nationwide indefinitely. Hong Kong, a part of China, has basically shut down all travel from the mainland. That's why it is essential that we immediately stop all travel on commercial aircraft between China and the United States. Making exceptions, of course, for American citizens to come back, as we just brought back yesterday, allowing essential trade to flow as long as crews on ships and aircraft are not allowed to go into the general population in America, and making exceptions, of course, for medical personnel to go into China to try to get a handle on this. It is essential that we take those steps, and essential that we get to the bottom of China's deceit and incompetence on this measure. And gentlemen, I raise this with you because you are responsible in your combatant commands for some countries that have the most fragile public institutions, to include the most fragile public health institutions in the world. So I ask, even though as of this morning there are not yet confirmed cases of coronavirus in your combatant commands, though I suspect there will be soon,
has Chinese biological WMD penetrated Australia?
The source of the virus. So we've been told a couple of things. So one is that it has come from a seafood market, and that's where the source is. Now, some of the world media, particularly the Western press, have taken that and reported that. I've seen some other reports that said that some people who had the virus initially, who were tested, never had any contact with the seafood market. So there's a question as to whether the seafood market is or is not the source.
What about the other source? So some people have said it might be from a Chinese laboratory.
Yes. The other thing to consider is that Wuhan has been designated as having a civilian laboratory. It's called the Wuhan National Biosafety Laboratory, and was set up early in 2018. And this is the only designated site in China that is allowed to study a whole host of these deadly viruses. So there are some rumors that it's come from this particular lab. Now, the interesting thing is that so this lab is a civilian operation, But there are reports coming from a couple of sources. One is Free Asia Radio, another one is coming from the Washington Times, and there is a belief that the Chinese government has a secret WMD biological program, and they have been using these civilian labs to actually do testing for their military-grade biological weapons. But they interviewed a former Israeli military officer who's a lieutenant colonel who has studied Chinese biological warfare and who actually has a doctorate in medical microbiology. And he basically said that this is the only place, if the Chinese were ever going to have a WMD program for biological weapons, this laboratory, which is only about 32 kilometers or 20 miles away from the supermarket, this is the only place in China where it could actually be. People who have talked about this virus on social media, because the first reports of this initially surfaced at the beginning of December. So if people talked about it on social media, they were arrested. If journalists reported about this whole situation, the journalists got arrested as well. So the fact that that the Chinese have been trying to suppress in terms of the information and in terms of the crisis. So people reading that is that there is something more sinister or there is something more significant about the origins of this virus that the Chinese government didn't want out among its own domestic population or for the world media to actually pick up. So we don't actually know whether it's come from the seafood market, has it come from the civilian side of the lab, has it come from the military side of the lab, and obviously I'm not a biological expert. When we see a former Israeli military intelligence officer who has deep expertise in this area, when he is suggesting that there is potentially a WMD agent that has been leaked out of a lab, or potentially someone who's been infected inside the lab who has just walked out, and that person was unaware that he got infected. The key point to make on this is our government, our chief medical officer, has incomplete scientific information about, in terms of the virus, in terms of where's it come from, what's actually involved here, and yet, we have not seen, what I would believe is the requisite sort of behaviour from our government to keep us safe. So, when you have all the information, you can make some very wise decisions. But in these sort of situations, when you don't have all the relevant scientific information, I would have thought that people would want to be more cautious. The obvious thing is to, if you are to be cautious, is to ensure that people, who are potentially in the affected area can't hop on a plane and come land in Sydney, and that's exactly what happened 3 days ago. And I think we need a royal commission. So we need a royal commission to the bushfires, because that whole situation, shouldn't have happened. This whole sporting scandal, we need an investigation to that, because that was just out and out corruption and bribery. And now I think we need a royal commission to actually understand who made the decision for these planes to land. So, for example, there are tourists who came from this affected area who went to the Philippines. All of those people have now been deported, from the Philippines, and all these people have to go back to China. North Korea, of all the countries in the world, they have stopped flights from China going into North Korea. And I'm thinking, well, if Kim up in Pyongyang can figure this out, why can't we're supposed to be smart, sophisticated first world, and yet, Kim from North Korea can figure this out. And he basically said, we're cutting off all flights from China, and we didn't do that. There is something fundamentally wrong with governance in Australia.
The coronavirus incubation period might be up to 24 days. The world has a huge dependence on Chinese pharmaceuticals.
China has indulged in an all-out people's war to tame the new coronavirus's outbreak. More than 760 million people have been quarantined now, which implies that nearly 10% of the world's population is under a stringent lockdown, and that is more than half of China. Villages and cities are flooded. Battalions of uniformed volunteers and political representatives are carrying out the biggest social control campaign in history, for a singular goal, which is to keep millions of people away from each other. China is in a wartime battle with the coronavirus pandemic. To tame the deadly outbreak, a Mao-style social control has blanketed China. Residential lockdowns of varying strictness from checkpoints at building entrances and on the streets have quarantined more than half of the country's population, summing up to 760 million. Yes, you heard that right. That is 10% of the world's population, which has been put under an infinite quarantine period. Many public places are in a virtual freeze. China, Beijing's prevention efforts have been led by its myriad neighborhood communities. Government's grid management system is keeping a close watch and a tighter grip of the Chinese population. The authorities are combining enormous manpower with mobile technology to track people who may have been exposed to the new virus. From moderate to severe, China has imposed different policies varying from city to city for fending off the epidemic. But has China's quarantine strategy been able to contain the outbreak?
And as the market's reaction to the outbreak causes concern for many of us overseas, the situation there is already very serious. More countries in Europe have confirmed cases, most of those patients having traveled to Italy, where the number of confirmed cases there is now 322, with at least 10 people killed by the virus. And the highest death toll outside of China is in Iran, where you see there their health minister exhibiting signs of the virus, a symbol of a nation struggling to deal with the outbreak. We'll get to the latest from China, from Asia and Europe. But first, we begin with Steve Osinsami in Atlanta, where the CDC just issued a stark warning.
U.S. health authorities tonight say there's no doubt we'll see more of this. Americans sick with the coronavirus who need to be kept in isolation.
The doors are specially sealed.
Carl Goldman is one of 57 Americans fighting the disease.
We are asking the American public to work with us to prepare in the expectation that this could be bad.
In their most clear warning yet, the CDC all but promises that the coronavirus will spread here and that Americans need to prepare.
We expect we will see community spread in this country. It's not so much a question of if this will happen anymore, but rather more a question of exactly when this will happen and how many people in this country will have severe illness. We really want to prepare the American public for the possibility that their lives will be disrupted because of this pandemic.
At a 3M factory in South Dakota, where they make masks and respirators that help protect from the disease, they're working 24/7 and still can't produce them fast enough.
We're told by the experts at NIH, CDC, that there is a very strong chance of an extremely serious outbreak of the coronavirus here in the United States.
In a hearing in Washington today, the government shared that it could need about 300 million respirators to be used by healthcare workers, but only has about 30 million on hand. That didn't go over well.
Sorry, I don't understand the question. Head of Homeland Security, do we have enough respirators or not?
What has authorities alarmed are the clusters of outbreaks happening outside of Asia that are not directly connected to Asia. On the Canary Islands off the eastern coast of Africa, more than 1,000 tourists are trapped in a hotel because an Italian guest came down with the virus. In Italy, more than 322 confirmed cases with 10 people dead, and they haven't even found the source of the outbreak. In Iran, at least 15 people were killed by the virus and nearly 100 are sick, including this health minister, who yesterday was on camera downplaying the danger as he's seen coughing and wiping his brow. Today he learned he too has the coronavirus. The Trump administration today was trying to bring calm to both the panic and the economic markets. Stocks are down today again.
We have contained this, I won't say airtight, but pretty close to airtight.
The president says they're throwing everything at this.
Very well under control in our country. We have very few people with it. The people are getting better. They're all getting better.
They're hoping the virus dies out with warm weather.
And Steve Osinsami joins us now from the CDC headquarters. We heard them say today it's not a matter of if, they are saying it's a matter of when. What else are they saying?
Well, they're really concerned about the clusters of outbreaks that are happening outside of Asia, across the world, that are not directly linked to Asia. That has them very concerned, and that's why they believe that we are, in their words, certainly going to see an outbreak here. One other thing, Lindsay, that I should mention is that there is big concern about these respirators and masks. There's a plant in South Dakota that has ramped up production to produce them. The government says that we could need about 300 million of those masks and respirators if there is an outbreak, and currently there are only about 30 million on hand. Lindsay?
The city of San Francisco has just declared a state of emergency in response to coronavirus. And yet you'll remember that for a month, Western leaders told us that the virus was under control and was unlikely to cause serious problems for anyone in our hemisphere. None of that was true, but saying it was less painful than rethinking the failed theology of globalism, so they went with it. Meanwhile, in China, an aggressively nationalist country that, if nothing else, definitely doesn't hate itself, authorities acted immediately and with force. With military-grade discipline, they shut down the city of Wuhan, home to 11 million people. The rest of the world watched this happen in real time, but yet assured themselves that everything was fine. It wasn't fine. We know that now. At least 35 countries have confirmed cases of coronavirus as of tonight. Last Friday, Italy reported 6. Yet at midday today, they had 283. And then by tonight, that number had risen to 322. That is a steep trajectory. So far, 11 people have died in Italy, and parts of the country are shutting down. Iran has confirmed 15 deaths plus 95 cases, though the real number is believed to be higher than that. One of those infected is the country's own deputy health minister, who was seen sweating profusely on Monday at a press conference downplaying the outbreak. He later appeared on an Iranian news program to reassure the country that everything was under control, and then he coughed on the woman interviewing him. In this country, there are more than 50 confirmed cases. Today, the Centers for Disease Control confirmed that a generalized outbreak is inevitable here. Quote, "It's not a question of if this will happen, but when." Officials warned Americans to be ready for severe disruptions to their lives.
Include dividing students into smaller groups, or in a severe pandemic, closing schools and using internet-based teleschooling to continue education. For adults, businesses can replace in-person meetings with video or telephone conferences and increase teleworking options. On a larger scale, communities and cities may need to modify, postpone, or cancel mass gatherings. Disruption to everyday life may be severe. But these are things that people need to start thinking about now. People are concerned about the situation. I would say rightfully so. I'm concerned about the situation. CDC is concerned about the situation.
So what exactly will a coronavirus pandemic mean for this country? Well, of course, you can't really say. It's impossible to predict with precision. But here's one forecast that caught our eye. It's from The Atlantic. It's titled, "You're Likely to Get the Coronavirus." The piece quotes extensively a Harvard epidemiologist. The article describes him as a cautious professional, the kind of person who carefully considers every word and then backs it with data. What the professor told the magazine is this, quote, "I think the likely outcome is that coronavirus will ultimately not be containable." He went on to predict that in the next year, 40 to 70% of the people on Earth will be infected with coronavirus. Now, not all of them will become ill. Many, he says, will be asymptomatic or feel no worse than they do with a cold. But nevertheless, 70% of the world's population is a big number. In fact, it's 5.4 billion people. Currently, the coronavirus appears to kill about 2% of the people who have it. So let's be generous for a moment and imagine that asymptomatic carriers are not detected, and the real death rate is only, say, 0.5%. That would be 1/4 of the current estimates. Even under that scenario, there would still be 27 million deaths from coronavirus globally. In this country, more than 1 million would die. And according to The Atlantic, many experts fear this may not be a one-off epidemic. Cold and flu season could become cold, flu, and coronavirus season for the foreseeable future. Will that happen? Well, obviously, we're praying that it doesn't. But we know one thing. Right now, as of tonight, America is not ready for this or for any major epidemic. Thanks to the CDC's flawed rollout of coronavirus testing, few locations in this country are even prepared to monitor coronavirus. And the economy, of course, isn't prepared either. The Dow Jones just fell close to 900 points today. That's on top of yesterday's 1,000-point drop. Overall, U.S. markets are down 8 to 9% compared to earlier this month. If that continues, it's not good.